She was just the billionaire's internship, until one night at work changed everything between them. She never imagined that walking through those glass doors would change everything about her life. Bryn Mitchell adjusted her blazer for the third time as the elevator climbed toward the 40th floor of the Harrison Tech building in downtown Seattle. Through the glass walls, the morning mist clung to the Puget Sound like a whispered promise. But her green eyes were focused on her reflection, searching for any sign of the small-town girl from Denver, who still whispered doubts in her ear. 23 years old, a master's student in corporate architecture, and she was about to step into one of the most innovative tech companies in the country. Her red hair caught the elevator's LED lights as she tucked a strand behind her ear, a nervous habit she'd carried since childhood. Floor 40, Harrison Tech headquarters, the automated voice announced. The doors slid open to reveal a reception area that looked more like an art gallery than an office. Clean lines, natural light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows, and the subtle hum of productivity filled the air. Behind a sleek desk sat a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a professional smile. "You must be Bryn Mitchell, our new architecture intern," she said, rising to greet her. "I'm Linda Chen, executive assistant. Welcome to Harrison Tech." Bryn's handshake was firm, a lesson her father had taught her before she left Colorado. "Thank you. I'm excited to be here. Mr. Harrison likes to meet all interns personally, but he's in back-to-back meetings today. You'll be working primarily with the design team on level 38. Linda handed her a sleek badge and tablet. "Your mentor, James Wright, is expecting you." As they walked through the corridors, Bryn noticed how the space seemed to breathe. Open, collaborative areas flowed naturally into private meeting rooms, and everywhere she looked, she saw her architectural theories come to life. This wasn't just a workplace. It was a carefully crafted environment designed to inspire. "That's Mr. Harrison's office," Linda mentioned casually, nodding toward a corner suite with frosted glass walls. Through the translucent barrier, Bryn could make out the silhouette of a tall figure standing before a window, hands clasped behind his back. "He's always here early," Linda continued. "Sometimes I think he sleeps in that office." Bryn found herself staring a moment too long at the distant figure. There was something in his posture, a weight that seemed both confident and solitary. "Bryn?" Linda's voice brought her back to the present. "Ready to meet your team?" The design department buzzed with creative energy. James Wright, a man in his 40s with kind eyes and rolled-up sleeves, introduced her to the team working on urban renewal projects. Within an hour, Bryn found herself deep in blueprints and 3D models, her architectural background proving more valuable than she'd dared hope. "You see spaces differently," James observed as she sketched modifications to a residential complex design. "Most people look at buildings. You look at how people will live inside them." The morning flew by in a blur of measurements, calculations, and design discussions. It wasn't until she was walking to the cafeteria for lunch that she saw him again. Blake Harrison was standing in line 3 people ahead of her, and Bryn was surprised by how normal he looked. No expensive suit, just dark jeans and a simple button-down shirt. He ordered a turkey sandwich and black coffee, same as half the people around him. But when he turned slightly, she caught a glimpse of his profile, and something in her chest tightened unexpectedly. He looked tired. Not just physically, but the kind of tired that comes from carrying too much alone. Their eyes met for exactly 2 seconds as he passed her table, 2 seconds that felt like a small eternity. His gaze was darker than she'd expected, more thoughtful, and in those brief moments she saw something that made her breath catch, a flicker of curiosity, as if he was trying to place her. Then he was gone, disappearing into the elevator with his simple lunch. Bryn sat there, turkey sandwich untouched, wondering why her heart was beating faster than it should be. She had no idea that at exactly 11:47 p.m. that very night, her desk phone would ring with a request that would change everything. What happens when destiny decides to work overtime? And would you have answered that late-night call? The phone rang at exactly 11:47 p.m., just like fate had planned. Bryn was curled up on her small couch in her Capitol Hill studio apartment, laptop balanced on her knees, working on a late assignment for her graduate program. The rain tapped against her window like impatient fingers, and Seattle's city lights blurred into watercolor streaks on the glass. Her phone buzzed first, a text from an unknown number. "Ms. Mitchell, this is Linda from Harrison Tech. Mr. Harrison needs urgent assistance tonight on the Meridian project. Are you available? LC." Bryn stared at the message, her heart doing something complicated in her chest. She'd heard whispers about the Meridian project, Something big, something secret that had the entire upper management working late shifts. And now they were asking her, a 3-day-old intern, to help? Before she could overthink it, her desk phone rang. The shrill sound cut through the quiet apartment like an alarm. "Hello? Ms. Mitchell?" The voice was deep, slightly tired, but unmistakably professional. "This is Blake Harrison. I apologize for calling so late." Bryn nearly dropped the phone. Blake Harrison. The Blake Harrison was calling her personally. "Oh, Mr. Harrison." "No problem at all," she managed, hoping her voice sounded steadier than she felt. "I have a situation. My lead architect had a family emergency and had to fly to Portland tonight. We have a presentation to the City Planning Committee tomorrow at noon, and I need someone with fresh eyes to review the residential integration plans." He paused. "Linda mentioned you have a strong background in urban residential design." "Yes, sir, I do. I know it's late, but would you be willing to come in? I can have a car pick you up." Bryn looked around her tiny apartment, at the stack of textbooks, the half-eaten ramen, the laundry she'd been ignoring. Then she looked at herself in the dark window reflection, red hair in a messy bun, wearing an old university sweatshirt and leggings. "I can be there in 30 minutes, she heard herself say. "Thank you. The car will be there in 15. The line went dead, and Bryn sat there for exactly 10 seconds before jumping into action. Quick shower, professional clothes, a travel mug of coffee that was stronger than it had any right to be. The black car that picked her up was sleek and quiet, with a driver who nodded politely but didn't make small talk. As they drove through Seattle's empty streets, Bryn watched the city transform from residential warmth to corporate coldness. Street lamps created pools of light in the darkness, and she found herself thinking about Blake Harrison's voice on the phone. Tired, yes, but there had been something else. Relief, maybe, when she'd said yes. Harrison Tech at midnight was a different creature entirely. The lobby was dimly lit, and the usual buzz of activity had been replaced by an almost cathedral-like quiet. Linda met her at the elevator, looking surprisingly alert for the late hour. "He's been here since 6 a.m., Linda said as they rode up to the 40th floor. "This project means everything to him." "What exactly is the Meridian Project?" Linda smiled, but it was the kind of smile that held secrets. "You'll see." The elevator doors opened to reveal a floor Bryn had never seen before, Blake's executive level. The lights were dimmed to a warm amber, and through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Seattle sparkled like a circuit board. "Mr. Harrison?" Linda called softly as they approached the corner office. "Send her in," came the response from behind the frosted glass. Linda gave Bryn an encouraging nod. "Good luck." Bryn took a breath and stepped through the doorway into Blake Harrison's private office. He was standing at the far window, silhouetted against the city lights, hands in his pockets. For a moment, she could only see his outline, broad shoulders, tall frame, the way he seemed to carry invisible weight. Then he turned around. The first thing she noticed was that he looked different than he had in the cafeteria. More tired, yes, but also more human. His dark hair was slightly disheveled, his sleeves were rolled up, and there were coffee stains on his shirt that somehow made him seem more real. The second thing she noticed was the way he looked at her, not like a CEO looking at an intern, but like a man seeing something unexpected. "Ms. Mitchell," he said, and his voice was softer than it had been on the phone. "Thank you for coming. I know this is unusual." "It's no problem, Mr. Harrison." "Blake," he corrected, moving toward a large conference table covered in blueprints and architectural models. "When you're saving my presentation, you get to use my first name." As he approached, Bryn caught the faint scent of his cologne mixed with coffee and something distinctly male. He stopped just close enough that she had to look up to meet his eyes. "So," he said, spreading his hands over the plans, "ready to see what we're really building here?" And as Bryn looked down at the blueprints, she realized she was about to discover something that would change everything she thought she knew about Blake Harrison. Some secrets are too beautiful to keep hidden. Bryn's breath caught in her throat as she looked down at the architectural plans spread across Blake's conference table. This wasn't just another corporate development. It was something extraordinary. "Affordable housing," she whispered, her green eyes scanning the intricate designs. "But not just any affordable housing, this is revolutionary," Blake finished, moving to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "Mixed-income residential towers with integrated community spaces, rooftop gardens, and sustainable energy systems. Housing that doesn't just shelter people, it builds communities." Bryn traced her finger along the blueprint's elegant lines, her architectural training recognizing the genius in every detail. The way you've designed the common areas to encourage interaction between different income levels. Blake, this is incredible. He watched her face as she studied his life's work, and something shifted in his expression. You really see it, don't you? Most people look at these plans and see profit margins and construction costs. But you, I see families, Bryn said softly, pointing to a children's play area cleverly positioned where multiple building sightlines converged. I see elderly neighbors watching kids play from their balconies. I see teenagers having safe places to gather. She looked up at him. I see hope. The silence that followed was charged with something neither of them was quite ready to name. Blake's dark eyes searched her face, and for a moment, the CEO mask slipped entirely. My presentation is at noon, he said quietly. The city planning committee has been skeptical. They think affordable housing means cutting corners, creating ghettos. I need someone who understands what we're really trying to build here. What do you need me to do? Help me show them what you just saw. For the next 3 hours, they worked side by side, redesigning presentation slides, creating visual narratives that would make the committee feel the warmth of sunlight streaming through carefully planned windows, understand how the building's design would encourage neighborly connections. Blake made coffee at 1 a.m. using an expensive machine hidden behind a panel in his office. He worked in his shirt sleeves, occasionally running his hands through his hair when he was thinking. Bryn found herself stealing glances at the way his brow furrowed when he concentrated, the way his hands moved with precise confidence over the architectural models. Tell me something, he said around 2:30 a.m., leaning back in his chair as they took a break. Why architecture? Why not something more predictable? Bryn curled her legs under her in the oversized leather chair, cradling her coffee mug. When I was 12, our neighbor's house burned down. The Hendersons. They had 3 kids and nowhere to go. The temporary housing the city provided was this awful concrete block building with tiny rooms and no soul. She paused, remembering. But Mrs. Henderson planted flowers in coffee cans outside their door. Just those little touches of beauty in such an ugly place. I realized then that spaces shape people. That good design isn't luxury. It's hope. Blake was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the soft lamplight. And bad design is despair. Exactly. Is that what you see when you look at most affordable housing? Honestly? Yes. Bryn met his gaze directly. But this project, Blake, this could change everything. Not just for the people who live there, but for how cities think about poverty, community, dignity. Something flickered across his features. Vulnerability, maybe. Or recognition. My mother raised me in public housing in Detroit, he said quietly. Government-built boxes with no character, no beauty, no hope. Just survival. He stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the sleeping city. I swore I'd never build anything that made people feel small. Bryn felt her heart constrict. Behind all his success, his wealth, his power, was a 12-year-old boy who understood what it meant to live in spaces that crushed dreams instead of nurturing them. That's why this project matters so much to you, she said. Not a question, but understanding. It's everything I've worked toward. But if the committee rejects it, he turned back to her. I've been fighting this battle alone for 2 years. Having someone else who sees the vision, you're not alone now. The words hung between them, carrying more weight than either had intended. Blake's eyes found hers across the dimly lit office, and for a heartbeat, the professional distance between them dissolved completely. Then his phone buzzed with a morning alarm, breaking the spell. It's 6 a.m., he said, sounding surprised. We've been working all night. Bryn looked outside to see the first hints of dawn painting the Seattle sky in shades of rose and gold. They had created something beautiful together in the darkness. Not just a presentation, but a shared understanding of what mattered. The presentation is in 6 hours, Blake said. But he wasn't looking at the clock. He was looking at her. And Bryn realized that somewhere between midnight and dawn, everything had changed. Sometimes the real work begins when the coffee wears off and reality sets in. The Harrison Tech building buzzed with its usual morning energy, but Bryn felt like she was moving through a different world entirely. She'd gone home at 7 a.m. to shower and change, her mind replaying every moment of the night before, the way Blake's voice had softened when he talked about his mother, how his fingers had brushed hers when they'd reached for the same blueprint, the look in his eyes when dawn broke over Seattle. Now, 3 hours later, she sat in the presentation room watching Blake command the attention of 12 city planning committee members with the confidence of a man born to lead. Gone was the vulnerable person who'd shared his childhood pain in the amber lamplight. This was the billionaire CEO the world knew, polished, powerful, untouchable. But Bryn could see the small tells, the way he touched his coffee mug when he mentioned community integration, how his gaze flickered to her for just a heartbeat, when he talked about spaces that nurture hope instead of crushing it. The residential towers will feature units ranging from subsidized housing to market-rate condominiums, Blake explained, clicking to a slide they'd perfected at 4 a.m. But unlike traditional mixed-income developments, our design ensures natural interaction between residents through shared amenities and carefully planned sightlines. Committee member Janet Crawford, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and sharper questions, leaned forward. Mr. Harrison, we've heard promises about mixed-income housing before. What makes this different from the gentrification disasters we've seen in other cities? Blake's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Ms. Crawford, if I may introduce Bryn Mitchell, our project consultant. She has particular expertise in residential community dynamics. All eyes turned to Bryn, and for a moment panic fluttered in her chest. She was just an intern, a graduate student. What was she doing in a room full of city planners who could make or break multi-million-dollar projects? Then she caught Blake's eye, and she saw something there. Not just encouragement, but genuine belief in her abilities. Bryn stood, her red hair catching the morning light streaming through the conference room windows. Ms. Crawford, the key difference is in the details most developers ignore. The playground visible from the senior living balconies isn't accident. It's intentional community building. The community garden accessible to all residents regardless of income level. The shared workshop spaces where a retired carpenter can teach a young parent how to build bookshelves. She moved to the architectural model, her hands gesturing with growing confidence. Gentrification happens when development treats people like statistics. This project treats them like neighbors. The room was quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that meant people were listening, really listening. And if it fails? Asked another committee member, Dr. Wilson Torres, a man who'd seen too many urban planning promises broken. Then we've built beautiful, affordable housing with community amenities, Bryn replied without hesitation. But if it succeeds, we've created a model that could transform how cities approach mixed-income development nationwide. Blake was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Pride, certainly, but something deeper. Something that made her pulse quicken despite the professional setting. The presentation continued for another hour, with questions that Blake and Bryn fielded as a team. They moved around each other in the space with a natural rhythm, finishing each other's thoughts, building on each other's points. To outside observers, they looked like partners who'd worked together for years. When the committee finally dismissed them to deliberate, Bryn found herself alone with Blake in the empty conference room. The adrenaline was wearing off, and she suddenly felt the weight of what had just happened. That was, she began. Incredible, Blake finished, loosening his tie. Bryn, the way you spoke about community building, the passion in your voice when you talked about neighbors, that's exactly what this project needs. I'm just an intern, Blake. I got carried away. He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne again, see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. You're not just anything. What you did in there, that was the work of someone who understands what we're building on a level most architects never reach. The compliment sent warmth spreading through her chest, but it was the way he was looking at her that made her breath catch, like she was someone worth seeing. Mr. Harrison? Linda's voice came from the doorway, breaking the moment. The committee is ready with their decision. Blake's professional mask slipped back into place so quickly that Bryn almost wondered if she'd imagined the intimacy of the moment before. Thank you, Linda. We'll be right there. As they walked back toward the conference room, Blake's hand briefly touched the small of her back, a gesture so subtle and quick that anyone watching might have missed it. But Bryn felt it like electricity, a reminder that last night had been real, that the connection between them wasn't just her imagination. The committee members were filing back into the room, their faces giving nothing away. Janet Crawford stood at the head of the table, a folder in her hands that contained the fate of Blake's life work. Mr. Harrison, Ms. Mitchell, she began, her voice carefully neutral. We've reviewed your proposal extensively. Blake's hand moved almost imperceptibly closer to Bryn's on the table, not touching, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of his skin. And we've reached a decision that we think will surprise you both. Victory tastes different when it comes with conditions you never saw coming. Janet Crawford's smile was the kind that made experienced business people nervous. Mr. Harrison, The committee has approved your Meridian project proposal. Blake's exhale was barely audible, but Bryn caught it. A sound of relief so profound it made her chest tighten with emotion. 2 years of his life, everything he'd worked toward, validated in a single sentence. However, Crawford continued, and the word hung in the air like a storm cloud, our approval comes with specific conditions. Blake's hand went still on the table. What kind of conditions? The city requires an independent oversight consultant for the duration of the project. Someone to ensure the community integration promises are kept, that the affordable housing components aren't compromised during construction. Crawford's eyes shifted to Bryn. We'd like Ms. Mitchell to fill that role. The conference room fell silent. Bryn felt her heart stop, then restart at double speed. I'm sorry, what? Your presentation today demonstrated exactly the kind of community-focused thinking this project needs, said Dr. Torres. We want you to be our eyes and ears, Ms. Mitchell. Full-time consultant position reporting directly to the city planning office. Blake turned to look at Bryn and she saw something complicated flash across his features. Pride, yes, but also something that might have been panic. Ms. Mitchell is currently completing her master's degree, Blake said carefully, and she's under contract as an intern with Harrison Tech, which we understand, Crawford replied smoothly. The city is prepared to offer a consulting fee that would cover her remaining tuition and provide substantial additional compensation. Consider it an investment in someone who clearly understands what this project should become. Bryn's mind reeled. 6 months ago, she'd been worried about student loan payments and whether she'd be able to afford her Capitol Hill studio. Now she was being offered a position that would solve every financial worry she had. But as she looked at Blake, she saw the walls going back up behind his eyes. The careful, professional distance that he'd let slip over the past 24 hours was reconstructing itself in real time. Could we have a moment to discuss this? Blake asked. Of course. We'll give you 15 minutes. When the room cleared, Blake stood and walked to the window, his back to Bryn. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Blake, she said softly, this is incredible. I never imagined. You should take it. His voice was controlled, empty of the warmth she'd heard in the pre-dawn hours. It's an extraordinary opportunity. But what about the internship? What about working together on... He turned around, and the CEO mask was fully in place. Bryn, this is your career we're talking about. Your future. You'd be insane not to accept. Something cold settled in her stomach. Is that what you really think? What I think is irrelevant. This is business. The word business hit her like a slap. After everything they'd shared, the vulnerability, the connection, the way he'd looked at her when dawn broke over the city, was she really just business to him? I see. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. And last night? Working until dawn? Sharing your story about Detroit? The way you... was preparation for this presentation. Nothing more. Bryn stared at him, searching his face for any crack in the professional facade. But Blake Harrison, Billionaire CEO, was very good at hiding what he didn't want seen. Fine, she said, lifting her chin. Then I'll take the position. Something flickered in his eyes. Regret, maybe, or loss. But it was gone so quickly she might have imagined it. Good. That's the smart choice. When the committee returned, Bryn accepted their offer with a handshake and a smile that felt like it belonged to someone else. Blake congratulated her with perfect professionalism, his hand briefly touching her shoulder in a gesture that could have been friendly, or could have been goodbye. As the meeting broke up and people filed out discussing timelines and logistics, Bryn found herself alone in the conference room with the architectural models that had brought them together. The tiny plastic figures in the community spaces looked so optimistic, so full of possibility. Her phone buzzed with a text from her roommate. How did the big presentation go? Bryn stared at the message, trying to figure out how to answer. The presentation had been a triumph. The project was approved. Her career had just taken a quantum leap forward. So why did victory feel so much like loss? Through the conference room's glass walls, she could see Blake in his office, already on a phone call, already moving forward, already treating her like just another consultant he'd have to work with instead of... What? What had she thought they were becoming? Her reflection in the window looked back at her. Red hair slightly mussed, green eyes bright with unshed tears she refused to let fall. She looked like a woman who'd gotten everything she'd asked for. She also looked like a woman who'd just realized she'd been asking for the wrong things. Blake's voice carried faintly through the glass. Yes, I understand the consultant will be reporting to you monthly. Of course, we'll maintain full professional boundaries. Professional boundaries. The words felt like nails in a coffin she hadn't known was being built. Bryn gathered her purse and walked toward the elevator, her heels clicking against the polished floor with a sound like a countdown timer. As the doors closed, she caught one last glimpse of Blake through his office window. He was looking directly at her, his hand pressed against the glass. And for just a moment she saw the man who'd shared his coffee and his childhood pain in the warm lamplight of a Seattle dawn. 3 weeks later, and the distance between them felt like an ocean. Bryn's new office was on the 32nd floor of the municipal building, with a view of Elliott Bay that should have made her feel like she'd conquered the world. Instead, she found herself staring across the Seattle skyline toward the Harrison Tech building, wondering if Blake ever looked back. Her official title was Community Integration Oversight Consultant, which sounded impressive on the business cards the city had printed for her. In reality, she spent her days reviewing construction reports, attending progress meetings, and pretending that seeing Blake twice a week in professional settings didn't make her chest ache. Ms. Mitchell, her assistant David Kim, knocked on her open door. The Harrison Tech team is here for the weekly progress review. Bryn's pulse quickened despite herself. Send them to conference room B, I'll be right there. She checked her reflection in her computer screen, a habit she'd developed since taking this position. Professional blazer, hair pulled back, the armor of competence she wore like a shield. Nothing like the woman who'd sat cross-legged in Blake's office chair at 2 a.m., sharing coffee and dreams. The conference room buzzed with the controlled energy of a high-stakes project. James Wright was there with his construction team, along with 2 other Harrison Tech executives she'd met but didn't know well, and Blake, sitting at the far end of the table, looking like he belonged in boardrooms the way other people belonged in their living rooms. Ms. Mitchell, he said when she entered, his voice professionally cordial. Thank you for accommodating our schedule. Mr. Harrison, she took her seat across from him, close enough to see the faint shadows under his eyes, far enough away to maintain the professional distance that had become their new normal. For the next hour, they discussed foundation work, permit approvals, and supplier schedules. Blake answered her questions with practiced efficiency, but never quite met her eyes. When their fingers accidentally brushed reaching for the same document, he pulled back as if he'd been burned. The community space construction is ahead of schedule, James reported, clearly pleased. We should be ready for the resident focus groups by next month. Excellent, Bryn said, making notes. I'll want to observe those sessions personally. Of course, Blake replied. We'll coordinate with your office. The meeting continued with the kind of polite, productive conversation that revealed nothing about the people having it. They could have been strangers discussing weather patterns for all the personal connection in the room. When the others filed out, Blake lingered, organizing papers with unnecessary precision. Bryn, he said quietly, not looking up, how are you settling into the new role? It was the first non-business question he'd asked her in 3 weeks. Fine, she replied, matching his careful tone. It's challenging work. Good. That's good. The silence stretched between them, filled with everything they weren't saying. Through the conference room window, Bryn could see construction workers on the Meridian project site, building something beautiful from the plans they'd perfected together in the amber lamplight of that endless night. Blake, she began, then stopped. What was she going to say? That she missed the way he'd looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching? That the professional distance was killing her slowly? That every successful project milestone felt hollow because she couldn't share it with the person who understood what it really meant? I should go, he said, standing abruptly. The next contractor meeting is in an hour. As he walked toward the door, Bryn found herself speaking before she could stop herself. Do you ever regret it? Blake's hand froze on the door handle. Regret what? Recommending me for this position. Creating this situation. For a long moment, he didn't turn around. When he finally did, the mask had slipped just enough for her to see the pain underneath. Every day, he said softly. Then he was gone, leaving Bryn alone in the conference room with the echo of 2 words that changed everything. That evening, Bryn found herself walking through Pike Place Market, needing the chaos of crowds and the smell of coffee and flowers to drown out the sound of her own thoughts. She was examining a display of autumn apples when a familiar voice made her freeze. The Honeycrisp are exceptional this week. She turned to find Blake standing behind her, looking as surprised to see her as she was to see him. He'd traded his business suit for dark jeans and a navy sweater, and the casual clothes made him look younger, more approachable, more like the man who'd shared his childhood stories over late-night coffee. Blake, I didn't expect to see you here. I live a few blocks away, he said, gesturing vaguely toward the waterfront. I come here when I need to think. About what? The question slipped out before she could stop it, too personal for their new professional dynamic. But instead of retreating behind his CEO facade, Blake looked at her with something raw and honest. About mistakes I can't fix. About choices that seemed right at the time, but feel impossible to live with now. A woman bumped into Bryn, apologizing as she juggled shopping bags, and Blake instinctively stepped closer, his hand briefly touching her elbow to steady her. The contact sent electricity up her arm, and she saw in his eyes that he'd felt it too. I should go, she said, but her feet didn't move. So should I, he replied, but he stayed exactly where he was. Around them, the market continued its evening rhythm. Vendors calling out prices, tourists taking photos, the eternal dance of commerce and community. But in their small bubble of space, time seemed suspended. Bryn, Blake said, his voice barely above a whisper. His phone rang, shattering the moment. He glanced at the screen and his jaw tightened. Harrison Tech emergency, he said, the professional mask sliding back into place. I have to take this. As he walked away, phone pressed to his ear, Bryn stood among the Apple vendors and realized that some distances couldn't be measured in floors of office buildings or conference room tables. Some distances lived in the space between what you wanted to say and what you were allowed to feel. Sometimes it takes a crisis to show you what really matters. The call came at 2:47 a.m. on a Thursday, jolting Bryn from the restless sleep that had become her norm since taking the consultant position. Her phone's harsh ring cut through the silence of her Capitol Hill apartment like an alarm. Ms. Mitchell? The voice was tense, unfamiliar. This is Detective Morrison with Seattle PD. There's been an incident at the Meridian Project construction site. Mr. Harrison specifically requested that you be contacted. Bryn's blood went cold. What kind of incident? Structural collapse. Part of the foundation gave way around midnight. Mr. Harrison is here, but... The detective paused. Ma'am, he was in the building when it happened. The words hit her like physical blows. Blake was hurt. Blake might be... She couldn't even finish the thought. Is he? He's alive. Paramedics took him to Harborview Medical Center about an hour ago. He kept asking for someone named Bryn to check the structural reports. 20 minutes later, Bryn was running through the hospital corridors in jeans and an oversized University of Colorado sweatshirt, her red hair still messy from sleep. The antiseptic smell and fluorescent lighting reminded her why she hated hospitals, but nothing could have kept her away. She found Blake in the emergency department sitting on a gurney with his shirt off, while a nurse cleaned a gash on his shoulder. His dark hair was dusty with concrete powder, and there was a bruise blooming along his left ribs, but he was alert, arguing with the doctor about discharge papers. I need to get back to the site, he was saying. The structural integrity needs to be assessed before... Blake! The word escaped her lips before she could stop it. He turned toward her voice, and the relief that flooded his features was so profound it took her breath away. For a moment, all the professional distance, all the careful boundaries they'd maintained evaporated completely. Bryn, thank God you're here. She moved toward him without thinking, her hands reaching out to touch his face, to confirm he was real and whole and alive. Then she caught herself, remembering where they were, who they were supposed to be to each other now. What happened? She asked, forcing her voice into professional mode even as her heart hammered against her ribs. I was doing a final walkthrough before tomorrow's inspection. The southwest foundation wall just gave way, took part of the scaffolding with it. He winced as the nurse applied antiseptic to his shoulder. Bryn, if this is a design flaw, if we miscalculated the load-bearing requirements... Hey, she stepped closer, close enough to smell the dust and concrete in his hair, to see the fear behind his determined facade. We'll figure it out. The plans were solid. You know they were solid. This might be a contractor issue or materials or just a freak accident. But if it's not, then we fix it. The words came out with more certainty than she felt. Blake, look at me. He met her eyes, and she saw not the confident CEO but the 12-year-old boy who'd grown up in government housing, whose mother had raised him to believe that good design could change lives. This project wasn't just his business, it was his heart, his legacy, his proof that he could build something better than what he'd grown up in. We fix it, she repeated more softly this time. The doctor interrupted their moment, declaring Blake fit for discharge with instructions for pain medication and rest. As they walked out of the hospital into the pre-dawn darkness, Bryn found herself automatically moving toward her car. I'll drive you home, she said. My car is at the site. I should... Blake. She turned to face him in the parking lot under the harsh sodium lights that made everything look surreal. You almost died tonight. You're going home. You're going to rest. And in the morning, we'll go to the site together and figure out what happened. Something shifted in his expression. We, you and me, the team that designed this project, the team that's going to save it. For a long moment, they stood there in the empty parking lot, and Bryn realized that somehow in the space of an hour, all their careful professional distance had crumbled as completely as the foundation wall. Why? Blake asked quietly. Why does this matter to you so much? It's not your company, not your dream. You could walk away, blame contractor error, and your reputation would be fine. The question hung between them, and Bryn knew her answer would change everything. Because it's not just your dream anymore, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Somewhere between that first night in your office and this moment, it became mine too. Those families who'll live there, those kids who'll play in the community garden, they matter to me because they matter to you. Blake's eyes searched her face in the artificial light, and she saw the exact moment when his last wall came down. Bryn, he said, stepping closer. I need to tell you something I should have said weeks ago. Her pulse quickened. What? The city consultant position. I could have recommended anyone. I could have argued against it, found alternatives, protected the professional boundary between us. He was close enough now that she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, close enough to count his eyelashes. But I didn't. Why not? Because I was scared. Because what I felt for you that night, working together, sharing coffee and stories and dreams, it terrified me. So I hid behind professionalism and distance and convinced myself it was for your own good. Bryn's breath caught. And now? Now I almost died tonight, and the only thing I could think about was that I'd wasted weeks pretending I didn't. He paused, his voice dropping to something raw and honest. Pretending I wasn't falling in love with you. The words hung in the air between them like a confession and a question and a prayer all at once. Blake, she whispered, reaching up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. I'm already there. When he kissed her, it was nothing like the careful, tentative connection she'd imagined. It was desperate and certain and full of all the weeks of longing they'd been hiding from each other. It tasted like antiseptic and coffee, and something that might have been forever. When they finally broke apart, Blake rested his forehead against hers, both of them breathing hard. What happens now? He asked. Bryn smiled, the first real smile she'd felt in weeks. Now we go save your project. Together. Love changes everything, including how you solve impossible problems. The Meridian Project construction site at dawn looked like a war zone. Yellow caution tape fluttered in the October breeze, and the collapsed section of foundation created a jagged wound in what should have been the building's corner. But as Bryn and Blake stood hand in hand at the site's edge, she felt something she hadn't expected. Hope. The structural engineer will be here in an hour, Blake said, his voice hoarse from the previous night's dust and emotion. He'd changed into work clothes, but Bryn could still see the white bandage on his shoulder beneath his flannel shirt. If this is a fundamental design flaw, it's not. Bryn squeezed his hand, then pulled out the tablet containing the original blueprints. Blake, look at this. Really look. She pulled up the foundation specifications, her finger tracing the load calculations they'd perfected that first night together. The math is solid. The materials list, the stress distribution, everything checks out, which means someone cut corners, Blake finished, understanding dawning in his dark eyes, or used substandard materials. Exactly. Bryn felt the familiar thrill of solving a puzzle, but now it was amplified by the man standing beside her, by the knowledge that they were partners in every sense of the word. We need to check the concrete composition, the rebar specifications, the actual materials delivered versus what was ordered. For the next 3 hours, they worked like detectives, cross-referencing delivery receipts with contractor reports, testing concrete samples, examining the failed foundation with the forensic attention of people whose hearts were invested in every detail. Here, Bryn said, pointing to a discrepancy in the steel reinforcement specifications. The contractor used grade 40 rebar instead of grade 60, saved probably $15,000 and compromised the entire structural integrity of this section. Blake's jaw tightened as he reviewed the evidence. Carmichael Construction. I trusted them because they've worked on 3 of our previous projects without issues. People change when enough money is involved, Bryn said softly. But Blake, this is fixable. It's terrible and expensive and will delay the project, but it's fixable. When the structural engineer arrived, a no-nonsense woman named Dr. Angela Foster who looked like she could bench press a steel beam. She confirmed their analysis within 2 hours. Substandard materials, no question, Dr. Foster reported. You'll need to tear out this entire section and rebuild with proper specifications. I'd estimate 8 weeks minimum, assuming you can get new permits expedited. 8 weeks. 2 months of delays on a project already attracting media attention, already being watched by other cities considering similar developments. Bryn saw the weight of it settling on Blake's shoulders like a physical burden. "We can do this," she said when Dr. Foster left them alone at the site. "Blake, look at me." He turned, and she saw not defeat, but determination in his eyes. This was the man who'd built a tech empire from nothing, who'd never forgotten the boy who grew up in ugly government housing and swore to build something better. 8 weeks means we miss the spring move-in timeline, he said. The families we've already approved for residency, the kids who were planning to start school in the district, so we help them find temporary housing. We cover their transition costs. We make this right. Bryn stepped closer, close enough to see the faint scar on his chin she'd noticed in the hospital. "Blake, this project isn't just about timelines and budgets anymore. It's about proving that sometimes when something breaks, you can rebuild it stronger than before." She wasn't just talking about the foundation, and they both knew it. That afternoon, they drove to Blake's penthouse apartment in Belltown, the first time Bryn had seen where he actually lived. She'd expected something cold and modern, all glass and steel like his office. Instead, she found warm hardwood floors, built-in bookshelves, and windows that framed Elliott Bay like living paintings. "I had it designed by the same architectural firm that did the community spaces for Meridian," Blake explained, watching her take in the space. "I wanted to live in the kind of place I'd want to build for other people." The apartment felt like him, sophisticated but warm, successful but not showy. A place where a man could think and dream and remember where he came from. "Blake," Bryn said, turning from the window where she'd been watching ferries cross the Sound. "What happens now? I mean, with us?" He crossed the room to her, moving with the careful precision of someone whose body was still healing but whose heart was finally whole. "I don't know," he admitted, reaching up to touch her face with the same gentleness he'd shown her in the hospital parking lot. "I've never been in love with someone I work with. I've never had a project matter this much. I've never felt like my personal and professional lives were the same thing." "Terrifying, isn't it?" she asked, leaning into his touch. "Terrifying," he agreed. "And perfect." When he kissed her this time, it was different from the desperate connection in the hospital parking lot. This was slow and certain and full of promises neither of them was ready to put into words. It tasted like coffee and possibility and something that felt suspiciously like forever. "I have an idea," Bryn said when they broke apart, both breathing hard. "About the project delays, about making this scandal into something positive. Tell me, what if we document the reconstruction? Show people that accountability matters, that cutting corners has consequences, but that good design can survive even contractor fraud." Her eyes lit up with the kind of excitement Blake had first noticed that night she'd understood his blueprints. "We make this transparent. We turn it into proof that integrity in construction isn't just idealistic. It's essential." Blake stared at her, and slowly, a smile spread across his face. "You want to turn our crisis into a case study. I want to turn our crisis into hope for every other city considering projects like this. Show them that when developers and consultants work together, when accountability and vision align," she gestured toward the window, toward the city spreading out below them, "we can build something beautiful." "We," Blake repeated, like the word was something precious. "We," Bryn confirmed, rising on her toes to kiss him again. Outside, Seattle continued its eternal dance of construction and creativity, of old buildings making way for new dreams. But inside Blake's apartment, two people who'd found each other in the space between professional obligation and personal longing were planning something that would change not just their own lives, but the lives of hundreds of families who deserved beautiful, dignified places to call home. Some stories refuse to stay hidden, especially when they're written in the language of the heart. The Seattle Times headline made Bryn's coffee go cold in her hands. "Romance and Reconstruction: The Love Story Behind the Meridian Project Crisis." She was sitting in Blake's kitchen, wearing one of his Harvard Business School t-shirts and watching the sunrise paint Elliott Bay in shades of gold and rose. They'd spent the past 2 weeks working 18-hour days to restart construction with new contractors, new materials, and unprecedented transparency measures. What they hadn't expected was for someone to notice that the city's oversight consultant and Harrison Tech's CEO had started arriving at the site together every morning. "Blake," she called toward the bathroom where she could hear the shower running, "you need to see this." The article was written by investigative journalist Marcus Webb, and it was both more and less damaging than Bryn had feared. Webb had done his homework. He'd traced the timeline from her late-night call to the project, through the foundation collapse, to their joint press conferences about reconstruction accountability. But instead of a scandal piece, he'd written something that read almost like a fairy tale. In an era of corporate corruption and failed public-private partnerships, the Meridian Project tells a different story. When structural fraud threatened to destroy Harrison Tech CEO Blake Harrison's ambitious affordable housing development, it wasn't lawyers or PR firms that saved the project. It was love. Blake emerged from the bedroom, hair still damp, reading the article on his phone with an expression Bryn couldn't decipher. "Well," he said finally, "we're officially public. Are you angry?" The question came out smaller than she'd intended. They'd been so careful, so professional in their public interactions, but apparently not careful enough. "Read the rest," Blake said, settling beside her at the kitchen island and pulling her close enough that she could smell his shampoo and the faint scent of the cologne that had become familiar as home. Bryn continued reading, her heart rate climbing with each paragraph. Sources close to the project reveal that Harrison and Mitchell's professional partnership has evolved into something deeper. "They finish each other's sentences in meetings," says one city planning official. "When they look at those blueprints together, it's like watching two people who share the same dream." But this isn't a typical corporate romance. Harrison, 34, grew up in public housing in Detroit and has dedicated his career to proving that affordable housing can be beautiful, dignified, and community building. Mitchell, 23, is a rising star in urban architecture whose thesis focused on residential design that nurtures human connection rather than simply providing shelter. "They're not just building apartments," explains Dr. Angela Foster, the structural engineer overseeing the reconstruction. "They're building hope. And sometimes when you're building something that important, you find exactly the person you're meant to build it with." "Blake," Bryn whispered, her eyes filling with tears she hadn't expected. "He made us sound like two people who found each other while trying to change the world." Blake's voice was soft, wondering, "Because that's exactly what we are." The article continued with details about the reconstruction timeline, the new transparency measures, and early interest from cities across the country wanting to replicate the Meridian model. But it was the final paragraph that took Bryn's breath away. Harrison and Mitchell's story reminds us that sometimes the most important foundations aren't made of concrete and steel, but of trust, shared vision, and the courage to build something beautiful together. The Meridian Project won't be ready for residents until next spring, but it's already succeeded in proving that love and ambition, properly engineered, can support any weight. Bryn's phone started ringing before she'd finished reading, then Blake's, then her landline. "City Planning Office," Blake said, checking his caller ID. "Your boss." "Harrison Tech PR Department," Bryn replied, looking at her screen. "Your crisis management team." They looked at each other across the kitchen island and simultaneously burst into laughter. "We're going to have to face this," Blake said when their laughter subsided. "Press interviews, questions about professional boundaries, probably some uncomfortable conversations with the city council. Are you ready for that?" Bryn asked, suddenly serious. "Blake, this could affect everything. Your company's reputation, the project's credibility, my career." Blake set down his phone and turned to face her fully, his hands finding hers across the granite counter. "Bryn, 3 months ago, I thought success meant building something impressive and profitable, something that would prove I'd escaped where I came from." His dark eyes were steady, certain. "But working with you, falling in love with you, building this project together, I've learned that real success isn't what you build, it's who you build it with." Her heart did something complicated in her chest. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying let them ask their questions. Let them scrutinize every decision we've made and every feeling we've shared." Blake's voice grew stronger, more certain. "Because what we have, what we're building together, both the project and this," he gestured between them, "it's worth defending." Bryn's phone rang again. This time it was Janet Crawford from the City Planning Committee. "Answer it," Blake said, squeezing her hands. "We face this together." As Bryn reached for her phone, she caught sight of their reflection in the kitchen window. Two people in love, surrounded by blueprints and coffee cups and the kind of morning light that makes everything seem possible. She looked like a woman who'd found exactly where she belonged. "Ms. Crawford," she said, accepting the call while Blake's hand remained steady and warm in hers. "Yes, I saw the article. No, I don't think it compromises the project's integrity. Actually, I think it proves something important about what we're building here." Blake smiled, the kind of smile that reached his eyes and reminded her why she'd fallen in love with him in the first place. Outside, Seattle was waking up to the news that sometimes when you're brave enough to build something that matters, you find not just success but the person you're meant to share it with. And in Blake Harrison's kitchen, with morning light streaming through the windows and the phone calls of a very public future waiting to be answered, Bryn Mitchell realized that some foundations are strong enough to support both professional dreams and personal happiness. All you have to do is build them together. 6 months later, and some buildings change everything, including the hearts of those who build them. The first family. "Bryn," Maria called out, her small hands dirty with soil. "Look, my mama says these flowers will still be blooming when I start 3rd grade. Bryn knelt beside her, helping steady the tiny seedling. "They'll be beautiful, Maria. Just like you." The Meridian project had become more than anyone had dared hope. The transparent reconstruction process, documented in real time through the city's website, had attracted attention from urban planners across the country. 3 cities had already approved similar developments, and Blake had been invited to speak at conferences from Portland to Boston. But more importantly, it worked. The mixed-income residents weren't just coexisting, they were becoming neighbors. Retired teacher Mrs. Chen from the market-rate condominiums had started an after-school reading program for kids like Maria. The teenagers who gathered at the community basketball court included both scholarship kids and those whose parents paid full price for their units. The rooftop garden had a waiting list. "Bryn," Blake's voice carried across the courtyard, and she turned to see him walking toward her with that smile that still made her heart skip after all these months. He was wearing jeans and the Harrison Tech t-shirt she'd given him for his birthday, looking more like the architectural dreamer than the billionaire CEO. "How did the final city inspection go?" she asked, rising to brush soil from her knees. "Perfect marks across the board. Janet Crawford said it was the most thoroughly documented affordable housing project in Seattle's history." Blake reached her and immediately pulled her into his arms, seemingly unaware that half the new residents were watching with barely concealed interest. "We did it, Bryn. We actually did it." The "we" still made her chest warm. Over the past months, as they'd navigated media attention, city council meetings, and the complex logistics of opening a revolutionary housing project, they'd become something neither had expected. True partners in every sense of the word. "Blake Harrison." They turned to see Maria's mother, Carmen Santos, approaching with a wide smile. Carmen worked 2 jobs, morning shift at a hospital and evening shift at a restaurant, but she'd still found time to help organize the residents' welcoming committee. "Mr. Blake, I wanted to thank you again," Carmen said, her voice thick with emotion. "Maria has her own room for the first time in her life, and the after-school program, the community kitchen, the safe place for kids to play." She gestured around the courtyard. "You didn't just give us apartments, you gave us home." Blake's throat tightened visibly. "Mrs. Santos, we just built the space. You and the other families, you're making it home." As Carmen returned to help her daughter with the marigolds, Blake turned to Bryn with an expression she'd learned to recognize, the look he got when something moved him beyond words. "I need to show you something," he said, taking her hand. He led her to the building's main entrance where a bronze plaque had been installed that morning. Bryn had expected something standard, corporate, forgettable. Instead, she found herself reading words that made her eyes fill with tears. The Meridian Project, dedicated to the belief that beautiful spaces create beautiful lives, built with love, accountability, and the conviction that home is a human right. Blake Harrison and Bryn Mitchell, founding partners. Sometimes the most important foundations are built in the heart. "Blake," she whispered, her fingers tracing the engraved words. "Founding partners? I talked to the city council last week, and to my board of directors, and to anyone else who would listen." Blake turned to face her fully, and she saw in his dark eyes the same vulnerability he'd shown her that first night they'd worked together. "Bryn, I want to make this official. Not just the project, us. I want to build a life together. I want to wake up every morning knowing that whatever we're creating it side by side." Her heart stopped, then restarted at double speed. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I love you. I'm saying you're the best architect, the best partner, the best woman I've ever known." Blake's voice grew stronger, more certain. I'm saying that 6 months ago, I thought success meant building something impressive. Now I know it means building something meaningful with someone you can't imagine living without. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box that made Bryn's world tilt sideways. I'm saying, Blake continued, dropping to one knee right there in the courtyard of their project, surrounded by the sounds of children playing and families laughing and dreams coming true, that I want to spend the rest of my life building beautiful things with you. Will you marry me, Bryn Mitchell? The ring was perfect, a simple solitaire that caught the afternoon light like a promise. But what took Bryn's breath away wasn't the diamond. It was the look in Blake's eyes, the certainty in his voice, the way he'd chosen to propose not in some fancy restaurant or romantic getaway, but here, in the place where they'd learned to trust each other, to work together, to fall in love. Yes, she whispered, then louder with all the joy and certainty flooding her heart. Yes, Blake Harrison, I'll build anything with you. When he slipped the ring onto her finger and stood to kiss her, the courtyard erupted in cheers. Maria Santos clapped her dirty hands. Carmen wiped happy tears, and Mrs. Chen called out from her balcony, "It's about time." As Blake lifted Bryn off her feet and spun her around, she caught sight of the Seattle skyline through the courtyard's carefully planned sightlines. The city spread out before them, full of spaces that needed improving, communities that needed building, dreams that needed architects. "So," Blake said when he set her down, both of them breathing hard and grinning like teenagers, "what should we build next?" Bryn looked at her ring, at the man who'd given it to her, at the families making themselves at home in the space they'd designed together. She thought about foundations and frameworks, about the difference between building something impressive and building something that lasted. "How about forever?" she said, rising on her toes to kiss him again. And in the courtyard of the Meridian Project, surrounded by the sound of children's laughter and the promise of marigolds that would bloom for years to come, two people who'd found love in the blueprint stage began planning their most important construction project yet, a life built together, on a foundation strong enough to support any dream. 5 years later, some love stories don't end. They just keep building, one dream at a time. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Harrison Mitchell Architecture, casting golden rectangles across the drafting tables where Bryn's team was putting the finishing touches on their latest project. From her corner office, she could see the original Meridian project rising in the distance, its rooftop gardens now lush and green, its community spaces filled with the daily rhythm of neighbors who'd become family. Mrs. Harrison Mitchell? David Kim, now her senior project coordinator, knocked on her open door. "The Portland delegation is here for the site tour." Bryn looked up from the blueprints she'd been reviewing, plans for Meridian Portland, the 7th iteration of their mixed-income housing model. Each project built on lessons learned from the last, incorporating new innovations in sustainable design and community building. Perfect timing. "Is Blake back from the conference call?" "Just finished with the San Antonio Planning Committee. He's meeting us in the lobby." Bryn gathered her presentation materials, pausing to glance at the framed photo on her desk. Blake and her on their wedding day, 3 years ago, standing in the Meridian Project courtyard where he'd proposed, surrounded by residents who'd become their extended family. Maria Santos, now 11 and captain of her school's debate team, had served as their flower girl. The Harrison-Mitchell partnership had evolved far beyond what either of them had imagined that first night in Blake's office. What started as one revolutionary housing project had become a nationwide movement. Cities from coast to coast were adapting their model, proving that affordable housing could be both beautiful and profitable when designed with love and built with integrity. "Ready?" Blake's voice carried across the lobby as Bryn stepped off the elevator. Even after 5 years, her heart still did that little skip when she saw him. He was wearing the charcoal suit she'd helped him pick out, but he'd loosened his tie in the way that meant he'd been deep in creative conversation. "How did San Antonio go?" she asked, automatically straightening his collar as he pulled her close for a quick kiss. "They want to break ground next spring. 300 units, including artist live workspaces and a community health clinic." His dark eyes lit up with the familiar fire of a new challenge. "They're calling it Meridian Arts District." The Portland delegation was everything Bryn had hoped for. A mix of city planners, community advocates, and developers who understood that housing wasn't just about providing shelter, but about creating the framework for human flourishing. As they toured the original Meridian project, she watched their faces transform from professional skepticism to genuine wonder. The key insight: Blake explained to the group as they stood in the community garden where Maria Santos had once planted marigolds, is that mixed-income housing works when it's designed to encourage interaction rather than segregation. Look around. You can't tell which residents pay market rate and which receive subsidies because they're all just neighbors. Mrs. Chen, now in her 70s but still running the after-school reading program, waved from her balcony where she was tending her herb garden. "Mr. Blake, Mrs. Bryn, come meet my new volunteer." They climbed to the second floor, where Mrs. Chen introduced them to Marcus Torres, a 15-year-old whose family had moved into one of the affordable units 2 years ago. He was helping a group of younger kids with their homework, his patient demeanor and natural teaching ability reminding Bryn of Mrs. Chen herself. "Marcus wants to be an architect," Mrs. Chen announced proudly. "I told him he should talk to you two about internship programs." Bryn felt her heart squeeze with familiar emotion. This was why they did the work, not just to house people, but to create spaces where dreams could take root and grow. "Marcus," she said, pulling out her business card, "call my office next week. We'd love to talk to you about our summer mentorship program." The boy's face lit up with the kind of hope Bryn recognized from her own journey from Denver to Seattle, from student to architect to partner in something that mattered. That evening, Blake and Bryn sat on the rooftop terrace of their Belltown home, sharing takeout Chinese food and watching the sunset paint Elliott Bay in shades of rose and gold. The Seattle skyline had changed over the years, dotted now with several buildings bearing the Harrison Mitchell architectural signature, thoughtful design that prioritized human connection over mere efficiency. "I got a call today," Blake said, setting down his chopsticks and reaching for Bryn's hand. "From the mayor of Detroit." Bryn's breath caught. Detroit, where Blake had grown up in government housing that crushed dreams instead of nurturing them. "They want us to design a comprehensive redevelopment plan for the neighborhood where I lived as a kid. 500 units, community centers, job training facilities." His voice was quiet, wondering. "They want to call it Meridian Renaissance." Bryn squeezed his hand, understanding the weight of what he was telling her. This wasn't just another project. It was a chance to transform the place that had shaped him, to give other kids what he'd never had. Beautiful spaces that whispered possibility instead of despair. "When do we start?" she asked. Blake's smile was radiant, full of love and gratitude and shared purpose. "I love that you said we. Always we," Bryn confirmed, leaning over to kiss him as the Seattle lights began to twinkle in the gathering dusk. As they sat together on their terrace, planning their next project and their next chapter, Bryn thought about foundations, how the strongest ones weren't made of concrete and steel, but of trust and shared dreams, and the daily choice to build something beautiful together. 5 years ago, she'd been a nervous graduate student answering a late-night phone call that would change her life. Now she was sitting beside the man she loved, planning to transform the neighborhood where he'd first learned to dream, surrounded by a city dotted with buildings that proved love and architecture could work together to change the world. Some foundations, Bryn realized, were built to last forever, and some love stories were really just construction projects that never ended. Each day an opportunity to add another room, another dream, another reason to keep building something beautiful together. The marigolds Maria Santos had planted in that first spring were blooming again in the Meridian Project gardens, bright and golden and eternal as the love that had built the spaces where they grew. What will you build with the love in your life? What dreams are waiting for the right foundation to help them grow? Your participation in the channel is very important. Please leave your opinion in the comments. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe to our channel and leave a comment below letting us know what you thought. Your feedback and support mean a lot to us. Stay tuned for more exciting stories.